Thank you for tuning into the Launchpad. I'm your host, Dave Kluge, and today I'm joined with two great guests, Dave Richard of CBS Sports and Joey Wright of Front Yard Fantasy and Razzball. Today we're going to have a reflective episode looking back at the 2021 season. We're going to talk about some of our hits, some of our misses, some things we learned, and we're also going to talk about how A.J. Dillon is just as good at fantasy football as he is at real football. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube page at youtube.com/footballguys so you can see this, the Audible, our short videos, and everything else that Footballguys has to offer throughout the entire offseason. Last year, I foolishly faded Jonathan Taylor due to concerns about him being in a backfield committee with Nyheim Hines, and I had egg all over my face from it. Dave, I want to start off with you. What was your biggest missed call from the 2021 season, and what did you learn from
it? you only want one?
Oh, no, we'll get into more, but we'll start. What was your biggest?
Why did I sign up for this podcast again? I was the Jerry Jeudy guy over at CBS Sports and on Fantasy Football Today. Really love the outlook for Jerry Jeudy. And I'll tell you what, first game of the year, played 31 snaps, 7 targets, 13 PPR points. You go ahead and project that out over 17 games. You're talking about 225 targets. I think he would have gotten there if he had never gotten hurt, Dave. The thing that I learned from it is, you really have to, if you're going to have a receiver that's got a less than very good quarterback, you need to really hope that things break right. And when it comes to breaking and ankles, high ankle sprains, not really the best thing. Players that have a high ankle sprain, I almost wonder if you just have to just get rid of them, put them out of your mind. The high ankle sprain has started to become one of those injuries in season where the guy can't recover from it to the point where he's going to be great for fantasy. And it's not just because of Jerry Jeudy. You think back to McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley in the past. I think that injury is really, really a bad one to have.
I'll go all the way back to Michael Turner. I remember Michael Turner completely derailing one of my seasons about 10 years ago because of a high ankle sprain. That is a tough one, but I don't think you could feel bad about Jerry Jeudy because whether you were a Jerry Jeudy guy, a Cortland Sutton guy, Noah Fant guy, if you were invested in any pass catcher in Denver, you missed. So you can't really beat yourself up about that one too much, Dave.
Yeah, but I had him on a lot of my teams, man. You know, when I like a guy, or I go all in. I'm not one of these guys. Well, I have to have equal shares of everybody. I'm not like that. I need to. I'm hog wild. Don't worry. There's a couple of guys that I had a lot of this year that turned out to be okay. But Jeudy was a big miss.
Yeah, unfortunately, we cannot predict injuries, and Jerry Jeudy was a victim of a pretty bad one. But Joey, same question to you. You know, we'll get to these hits in just a little bit and beat our chest a little bit, but let's go ahead and focus on some of the misses. What was your biggest miss from the 2021 season, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, I got a lot of content for the misses. Let me tell you. No, my biggest miss, honestly, was Ben Roethlisberger. I thought with the surrounding cast around him, paired with an entire offseason to recover that elbow, he'd bounce back better than where he was being drafted as the 25th overall quarterback. In 2020, he finished 14th with career lows in yards per target, but somehow his second highest year in touchdowns. So I thought, well, there's probably something there, but I was wrong. He finished 25th at the position, just where he was going. And what I learned from the lesson, I kind of already knew, and that's not to let nostalgia cloud my view. I'm a big fan of waiting on quarterback in one quarterback redraft leagues. And last year was the first year since 2015. At least 5 of the top 10 quarterbacks didn't come from outside the top 10 in ADP. So through Roethlisberger's career, he's always one of those guys for me. And I thought he could do it one more time for me before he retired, but no, he didn't.
And I pointed that out last offseason. I said, this is kind of crazy. We got Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool. All of these guys are ranked as top 25 wide receivers. We got Najee Harris, who's ranked as a top 10 running back. Why is nobody expecting Ben Roethlisberger to do anything? And somehow he didn't. I mean, he had a terrible season all the way, forced him into retirement, which I think we kind of expected. But yeah, I'm with you. I was expecting big things from Ben Roethlisberger as well. Couldn't really understand his ADP, but people, the consensus, whoever it may be, was smarter than I because I missed that one. Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to episode 26 of the Launchpad. This is technically episode 26, but this might be a first time for a lot of you. For those of you that are watching that have not seen this show before, every single week I bring on 2 guests and we talk about fantasy football. since this is the off season, we're going to have a ton of flexibility on topics. In season, though, what we do is focus on some of the big games with some big fantasy implications, and we'll talk about Thursday night football as well. But right now, we've got draft coverage, free agency, camp buzz, all this other stuff, but that's still a little ways out. Right now, we are going to have a retrospective episode on the 2021 season and what we took away a little bit. I am joined today with Dave Richard and Joey Wright. Dave over at CBS Sports, thrilled to finally connect with you. Really excited to chop it up a little bit and talk today, but why don't you go ahead and let everybody know where they can find you on social media, where they can find you on TV and all that good stuff.
Always good to talk with a fellow Dave and a fellow Chicagoan. So thank you for having me. You can follow me on Twitter at Dave Richard, all one word. You can also just go to Google, type in Dave Richard Fantasy. You'll get all kinds of good stuff. And I really love talking about CBS Sports HQ. This is where our shows, Fantasy Football Today, they're on every day during the football season. But it's also the place where you should go when there's breaking sports news if you want immediate analysis. And I'm not talking just fantasy analysis, just immediate analysis so that you're in the know with what's going on. It's not just NFL, it's college sports, it's baseball. We've got all kinds of stuff on this lockout right now with Major League Baseball, all kinds of stuff going on with soccer. You know, CBS Sports has a lot of soccer on it. So of course we do a lot of stuff with what's going on overseas and here in the States. Here's my wish for everybody watching, Dave and Joey. When there's breaking sports news, I want you to remember CBS Sports HQ. All you have to do is either download the free CBS Sports app or go literally cbssportshq.com. You don't have to give your email address. You don't have to pay a penny. Get free sports news, highlights, and analysis. When there's breaking news, there's no better place for you to go and immediately get the latest word on it and what happens next for whatever that breaking news is on CBS Sports HQ.
It's nice to have that because what you guys do is basically, cut out all of the garbage that we don't want to see. If you put on, tweet alerts for Adam Schefter, Tom Pelissero, and those guys, you're going to get that breaking news, but you're also going to get a lot of filler in between. So going on a website like that where it's nice and filtered and you get all of the important news, very important to have. So yeah, be sure to check that out if you have not already. And then Fantasy Football Today, you guys have been doing that for quite a while now. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that podcast, who you're on that with and what you guys talk about?
I am on Fantasy Football Today with Heath Cummings, formerly of Footballguys. I think it's important to mention him first in this case. Jamie Eisenberg, who's been with CBS Sports for pretty much as long as I have. Adam Azer, our host with the Terrible Takes. Chris Towers is on there. And we podcast. Can't say we podcast every day during the off season, Dave, but certainly 3 times a week plus emergency episodes when necessary. I got a feeling we're going to start getting to some emergency episodes in March when free agency kicks into high gear. We did it last year. I think we had like 18, 19 emergency podcasts where that's an example of what we like to do on CBS Sports HQ. There's breaking news. Let's react to it. Let's put something in people's ears immediately that can help them react. We share our thoughts with you. By no means do we think that we're the end all be all when it comes to fantasy football, but we love to share the insight that we gather. We all come from different perspectives. We all love fantasy football and we love helping people win their leagues. So give us a try if you haven't yet. Fantasy Football Today, the name of the podcast. You can find it wherever you got this podcast. And we're also on YouTube in case you don't like downloading podcasts. You can watch our pretty faces, and I'm lying when I say pretty, but you can watch it on YouTube. Go to YouTube, search for Fantasy Football Today. Every episode's right there.
Absolutely. Check out that show. It is a ton of fun to watch. Heath Cummings, Jamie Eisenberg have both been on this show before, so I like to call them friends of the show. Another friend of the show who has been on before, Joey Wright. You probably recognize this guy from Front Yard Fantasy and Razzball. He's got Starts, Sits, and Salutations, which is one of my favorite series of the offseason. Oh my goodness.
Mine too.
By the seashore. Lots of S's there. But Joey, go ahead, introduce yourself to everybody watching. Let them know where they can find you on social media and what you got going on this offseason.
So you can find me on Twitter at the Joey Wright and pretty much everywhere else that there's like a social media at the Joey Wright. I am with Front Yard Fantasy. I do the Fun Friday shows with them. Next year, I'm going to be on Office Hours, which is a starts and sits type show where you can, ask, who would I rather start? Who'd I rather sit, between players. So looking forward to that. I will be doing another whole season of Starts and Salutations for 2022 with a whole narrative, and it should be a killer season. I'm also with Razzball. I'm writing with them. I'm stepping away from the waiver wire articles. So if you came to me for your waivers last year, sorry, I'm not going to be doing that anymore. But I've got something I'm excited about. It's a little more matchup based that I'm going to be writing. It's a weekly column, so I'm looking forward to that. If you like pro wrestling, I always mention it because I love it. I do all the AEW content at the Matt Wrestling Podcast, and there's a pay-per-view coming up in 2 weeks. So yeah, so if you like fantasy football and pro wrestling, like I'm your guy.
Joey is a budding star in this industry, big film buff, just a all-around fun, genuine guy. But definitely recommend checking him out on Twitter at the Joey Wright as well. Fun presence over there. But let's go ahead and get right into this. And I made you guys talk about your misses first. I will talk about one of mine. I said that there is no chance I would take Jonathan Taylor in the first round. And I don't know if you could have had a worse call than that. And I guess what I took away from that is my reasoning for, I guess, fading Jonathan Taylor was worries that there was going to be some sort of backfield committee. We saw Nyheim Hines with a bunch of touches when Jonathan Taylor was a rookie. Nyheim Hines was on the books with a pretty sizable contract. I thought that there was no way that they were going to phase him out of the game, making the money that he was making. And what I learned is that when you've got a guy like Jonathan Taylor, who I think you can chalk up as a true generational talent, I know that gets thrown around very often, but that is, I think you could say that pretty safely with Jonathan Taylor. Just don't fade a guy that good. He is going to get his touches. He's going to carve out a role for himself. And what I learned and adjusted is going into next year, Jonathan Taylor is very obviously my 101. I will not be making that mistake again. But let's go ahead and jump right in. We got a lot to talk about today. Dave, hopefully no breaking news comes through. Hopefully you can make it through the hour without having to do an emergency pod. You know, Aaron Rodgers gets traded or something like that. Hopefully we can make it through the hour with no breaking news. But Joey, let's go back to you. What was another miss that you had from the 2021 season that we could talk about a little bit?
So because of how much I talked about him in the offseason, I feel like I should just mention him first. Curtis Samuel. I mean, you can let me off the hook for an injury, but I'm not going to let myself off the hook because I planted my flag really hard on Curtis Samuel. Even after the Ryan Fitzpatrick injury, even after we knew he wouldn't be on the field for the start of the season, I was really dedicated to the potential that he and Fitzpatrick could have together. And once Fitzpatrick went down, I really should have backed off. And Samuel only started one game in 2021 and appeared in 4 more after that. Maybe I'll be rewarded with a bounce back in 2022, but for 2021, it was a big miss.
Well, I got to say right now, he is essentially free in dynasty drafts. If you're doing any of those, I did a startup the other day and I got Curtis Samuel in the 20th round. And I could see Curtis Samuel bouncing back this year with JD McKissic being a free agent. There's a chance that he walks in for free agency. And we know that Curtis Samuel has that ability to play out of the backfield. He's he can do some, fun stuff like JD McKissic can. So there's a chance that maybe he takes on a role like we saw him have in Carolina. Dave, before you talk about a miss, is there anything that you wanted to add about Curtis Samuel? Because that's a really intriguing player.
I'm not intrigued by him at all. I was worried about the injury, and I felt like with Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback and with Logan Thomas still stepping up, I felt like there was room for maybe 2 pass catchers in Washington to be good. And McLaurin was obviously one. Logan Thomas was the other. And I wasn't sure if Samuel would get that same type of work like we saw in his last year, really the last 2 years in Carolina. And now I don't know where he stands with the current coaching staff. We'll probably get a pretty good idea of where he stands once free agency starts, once the draft ends, I guess, and see what moves Washington makes this offseason. But that's also going to be a spot where they need a quarterback. And I still don't think that there's going to be anything there that'll make me inspired to even take a late pick on Curtis Samuel.
And we've heard some, rumors that possibly Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, that somebody might end up in Washington. Do you think if Taylor Heineke is there again, I mean, is this just we're kind of fading everybody not named Antonio Gibson next year? Or do you think that Taylor Heineke could support a wide receiver that could still put up some solid numbers?
I think we've seen enough of Taylor Heineke to know that he will bring down what Terry McLaurin's upside should be. So you'll draft McLaurin as a number 2 fantasy receiver, and I would imagine he will deliver like an inconsistent number 2 fantasy receiver.
Yep. Agree with you there. Well, let's move on to the next one, Dave. What is another miss that you had from last season that we think we can probably learn something from?
So on our podcast, we had a big debate about which tight end would be better, Mark Andrews or TJ Hawkinson. Guess what side I was on? I was on the Hawkinson side. I believe that Hockenson would be the top target getter for the Detroit Lions. I believe that he would be also a big-time red zone threat. I remembered how Jared Goff would lean on his tight ends with LA, and I noticed that the wide receiver core for Detroit was really, really bad, like easily the worst in the NFL bad. And through the first 2 weeks of the season, I was looking great. Hockenson had 2 great games to start the year. Mark Andrews was nowhere to be found. I did like Andrews better in half and non-PPR, but in full PPR, and that's really what matters here, I thought Hockenson would be better. I thought he'd be consistent and strong and possibly finish as a top 3 tight end over the course of the season. And Hockenson did start strong, faded quickly, got hurt, ended up missing the last 5 games of the year for Detroit. There was St. Brown that stepped up in a major way during those games, kind of took his place in terms of getting a lot of targets. He still averaged 7 targets per game, Dave. And I think that I think that there's room for him to grow on that a little bit. And it's tough to find tight ends that get that type of target volume from game to game. So I'm still going to be cool with drafting TJ Hockenson, and he might even be the guy who I'll gravitate toward if I miss on the top. I guess it's going to end up being like the top 4 tight ends, top 4 or 5 tight ends that are going to go relatively early on draft day. But Detroit's going to add talent at wide receiver. Looks like Jared Goff's going to stay there. Offensive line's pretty good, but I can't feel as good about Hockenson in 2022 as I did in 2021. And Mark Andrews just he lost some of the receiving talent. And really what happened to Andrews is the quarterbacks changed in Baltimore. And he was always good with Lamar Jackson. But when Lamar Jackson got hurt, Andrews' fantasy points went through the roof. I could look up the number for you. I don't have it in front of me.
I pulled
right
it up.
this second.
That's exactly what I was going to get at. Yeah, I've got it pulled up right now. Prior to Lamar Jackson getting injured, and then TJ Hockenson got injured right around the same time, in PPR, they really weren't that far off, less than 3 points. Mark Andrews was at 14.9 points, and then TJ Hockenson was the tight end 3 with 12.1 points. So they were still pretty close. It's just Mark Andrews went nuclear when Tyler Huntley took over at the end of the season. I was checking out his splits earlier today, and I believe it was 14 and 22 points were the splits with and without.
That's
Lamar
it.
Jackson.
That's exactly it. I just found it. Yep, I had a page with it. You want to know what it was for Marquise Brown, just for fun, because that was another miss? We'll throw him in.
Let's hear it.
I loved Marquise Brown. With Lamar Jackson, 16.3 PPR points per game. Without him, 8 PPR
and the craziest
points
thing
per
about
game.
that split, he actually saw more targets without Lamar Jackson. His targets went up almost 2 or 3 per game, but catch rate, yards per catch, touchdown rate, everything plummeted. So I think anybody invested in Mark Andrews or Marquise Brown is hoping that Lamar Jackson can come back. I think it was such a small sample size that we saw Mark Andrews just getting hyper targeted, especially in the red zone, and that really inflated his value. But I think overall, this passing game benefits from Lamar Jackson.
Agreed. And this is why I'm still taking Kelsey ahead of Andrews in 2022, is because I think if you look at the total of Andrews' year, yes, it was a monster year, but that split with and without Lamar Jackson, that scares me off from thinking that Mark Andrews is going to repeat what he did just year to date from last year. I'm just going to take what I think is the safe play with Kelsey. He might not finish as the tight end 1, but he's got a pretty good track record of doing that. I'm happy to take him ahead of Andrews.
Now, one guy, and we'll stay on the topic of tight ends here because one of my misses from last year was fading Kyle Pitts. And if I can be honest, I don't know what I learned from this because I am going to still continue to fade rookie tight ends. I mean, we've just seen it historically. We've got Evan Ingram had his one outlier of a season in like the last 50 years. And then Kyle Pitts came out and had the best rookie season we have seen since Mike Ditka in 1960 something. I mean, what he did was completely unfounded. So I think that we can now, after looking at a year of data and what Kyle Pitts was able to do, I mean, you've got to put him in the top 3 or 4 tight ends overall. But how are you guys feeling about Kyle Pitts heading into last year? Joey, let's start off with you. I just couldn't buy into the hype because of the history of rookie tight ends, and it burned me pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, without knowing what the receiving core is going to look like next year, I mean, if Calvin Ridley is going to come back or not, it sounds like he might go somewhere else. I've heard Philadelphia, but I don't know. I mean, I expect Kyle Pitts to get a good number of targets next year, and he got targets this year, but his touchdowns, there was no touchdowns this year. So I think there's a lot more promise. Well, yeah, there was
the
one
entire season, one touchdown.
Yeah. So I definitely think that number will come up next year.
Hold on. Didn't he score in the Pro Bowl?
Oh, all right. Yeah. So we're going to count. We can't count that. That was his first touchdown in America. I think that was.
Yeah, he even said he tweeted as much.
Yep. He had the one in the London game.
It's kind of cool that he knew that.
And it was cool to see because his value just went crazy because that was a game that nobody is going to tune into a Jaguars Falcons game, but when it's the only game early in the morning, everybody watched
Yeah.
that, and that was Kyle Pitts' coming out party. So it was awesome to see him step up on a big stage. Unfortunately, wasn't able to really recapture that magic of that game, but as far as heading into this season, like you said, there's a big four this year, and I think it's very clear cut that you got Travis Kelce, George Kittle, well, maybe five, right?
Yeah.
Travis Kelce, George Kittle, Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, and I mean, are we putting? Yeah, I guess it's the four.
Cole Kmet.
Cole Kmet, yeah, of course, yeah, breakout.
No.
Another
But, I
miss.
mean, is Waller still in that elite tier? I guess that's where I'm kind
I
of.
think he belongs in there still.
Yeah,
I know last year was ugly, and I know he's getting older, and maybe it's a different group for Dynasty, and I don't know if Kittle and Kelce are in that group for Dynasty.
Yeah.
But
I know you
I think
projected
Waller
out-
still belongs.
You projected out Jerry Judy's week one numbers, extrapolated out the season. Darren
Yeah.
Waller was my number one overall tight end heading into last year. I actually was silly enough to put him ahead of Travis Kelce. So if we're just focusing on week one, I'm going to take my win because he was on pace for 300 something targets. So I'm just saying. But Joey, let's go on to you. Let's each cover one more miss before we get to pump ourselves up a little bit here.
Okay, yeah, I missed on the Packers backfield. Here's another higher powered offense. I was expecting the run game to have a big part of, and I wasn't completely wrong. I just didn't think AJ Dillon would out carry Aaron Jones. When last year when Aaron Jones had Jamal Williams behind him, he was out carrying him 2-1 almost the last two seasons before that. And I didn't think Dillon would, not only take the role of Williams, but then add more to it. Looking forward to 2022, I've actually seen a lot of early takes of people taking Dillon over Aaron Jones. And for those playing best ball right now, you animals, Aaron Jones is the RB16 and Aaron Jones is the RB27 in underdog drafts. So you have a nice opportunity to wait for Dillon and pass on Jones.
Yeah. So I got a video that's coming out on the Footballguys YouTube channel tomorrow morning where I talk specifically about that. And I think
I didn't want to call you out my name.
Well, there was a change of guard, and I think that people just aren't really 100% recognizing it yesterday. And I think that it was maybe it happened because of an injury to Aaron Jones, but Aaron Jones was 100% healthy at the end of the season, and AJ Dillon was still getting those touches. So I looked at this yesterday before the injury. Aaron Jones was seeing 17 touches per game. After the injury, that dropped down to 13.2, which doesn't sound huge, but AJ Dillon's touches jumped from 10.2 per game to 16.5. So their usage almost completely flipped. And then we saw AJ Dillon, his targets tripled once Aaron Jones came back. So not only is he getting the red zone work, but he's also getting some pass catching work. I think that there could be a change of guard happening there. I don't know if I do have AJ Dillon ahead of Aaron Jones in my rankings right now. I realize that that's a little bit spicy, but I think as the offseason progresses and people start looking at the situation a little bit closer, I think they're just going to get tighter and tighter in value because right now there's a full 4-round gap in between the two of them. And I think that is just ludicrous. Dave, I see you nodding. Do you have something to add here?
I mean, I could. I don't know what kind of time that we've got, but I've got a little bit different numbers for Dillon and Jones than what you had, Dave.
All right.
I looked at the games from week 12 through 17. They all played those games together, and then they were also together in the divisional round. I've got AJ Dillon with 72 carries and 11 catches. I've got Aaron Jones with 60 catches and 24 catches and 60 carries. Dillon did a lot better when it came to touchdowns. Had plenty of short yardage scores. Jones had a couple as well. They mixed and matched there. I still think Jones has an edge when it comes to pass catching. You'll remember the one playoff game the Packers had. Aaron Jones went ridiculous. He was great. 9 catches, like 120 yards, something like that. So that might have spiked his numbers, but I know that he can still do that. I'm worried that this could be a bit of a hornet's nest for fantasy managers this year. I don't mind taking Jones ahead of Dillon in PPR. Maybe half PPR, but probably all three formats, if I'm being honest. But I think they're going to be much closer together in a little farther apart in half, a little further apart in PPR. And if you're looking for a value between the two, I would lean toward Dillon, who he's so much fun to watch. And I know that we love him pulverizing for touchdowns, but I don't know if he's got the same type of juice that Aaron Jones has. And I think if the Packers keep Aaron Rodgers around, it's going to be great for both running backs, but it'll also mean that they're going to be right around that same type of workload that you laid out, where neither one's getting that close to 15 touches per game.
So I think and I've heard people talk about that playoff game, but I'm pretty sure in that divisional game that AJ Dillon was knocked out a bit early. I thought he was knocked out in the second quarter. I could be mistaken, and I don't want to take
You're
away from what
probably
Aaron
right,
Jones
but he
did,
still
'cause
had a lot of work.
yeah, because Aaron Jones and I think that Aaron Jones is still going to have that week to week ceiling where he can drop a 40 burger at any time because of his pass catching upside. I mean, we know that he can take a ball from anywhere on the field to the house. He's kind of a poor man's Alvin Kamara, if you will. So I still like his week to week upside. Over the course of the season, though, I think that I'm just leaning towards AJ Dillon. I expect him to, hold onto that red zone work because he showed that he was very, very good at it. Either way, though, like you said, this could end up being a little bit of a hornet's nest, and we might be overvaluing both of these guys, and they could both come up short of ADP. Let's talk about one more miss, Dave. Did you have anybody else you wanted to highlight, or should we just jump into the chest beating?
Nope, I was perfect. Otherwise, I won't talk about Elijah Moore and how I was crazy about him. And let me tell you why I thought he was a miss. Every year I've got one guy that I'm taking late, and I sing it from the rooftops for everybody to jump on me with. And Elijah Moore was that guy. I like that you both take a drink while I'm talking. I guess that means you're expecting me to go on for like at least a minute here. Elijah Moore, I love the talent. I believe just enough in Zach Wilson based on the preseason. And I thought that Elijah Moore would have a really good opportunity. I started using hashtag Elijah and everything that I did. Week 1, not so great. Had a drop pass, didn't look good. Week 2, not great. Week 3, got a concussion. I think that's how it went. He might have been concussed in week 2. I don't remember. But I remember telling people at the time, I'm going to drop Elijah Moore, but I'm going to come back to him. And when I went back to him, he still wasn't doing great. So I dropped him again. And then, of course, he had that little flash for a few weeks where he was outstanding. And now everybody's going to be drafting him as a breakout wide receiver. I wish he had had that breakout right when the season had started. I would have felt a lot better about the call. I think I can still say that he's a good talent, and I'm glad that I recognized it. But it kind of goes back to what I started the podcast with, Dave, that if you don't have a very good quarterback throwing to your receiver, you need to hope everything breaks right otherwise. And there was a time where things were breaking right for Elijah Moore. I'm hoping that will continue with Zach Wilson. I'm hoping he plays a little bit better, hoping that the offense takes a nice step forward and they don't have the tragedy that befell them before the season where Greg Knapp died and they had to kind of work on the fly with that offense. I think that Elijah Moore can be a great second-year breakout wide receiver, but I wish he had been a week 1 breakout receiver first.
And now you talk about it with that late season breakout, and Ryan McDowell tweeted this out today, and this is off of DLF ADP, so obviously it's dynasty. But I was kind of surprised to see how high Elijah Moore was. He re-ranked the 2021 rookie class based on current ADP, and Elijah Moore came in at 6th, ahead of Travis Etienne, ahead of Elijah Mitchell, ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown, and this is the one that really blows my mind, ahead of Devonta Smith. Devonta Smith went for almost 1,000 yards as a rookie. And right now, it seems as if fantasy managers, especially in the dynasty community, are valuing Elijah Moore well ahead of Devonta Smith. So I know you said you're a big Elijah Moore guy. How would you feel about those two if you're picking between one or the other?
We've done a couple of mocks already, and I'm looking at them now. The first one, Devonta Smith did go ahead of Elijah Moore by 2 picks. That was in a full PPR. That was in mid-January. Bear with me for a second. In the second one that we did, this is a half PPR. Elijah Moore went with the last pick in round 4. He went ahead of Tyler Lockett. He went ahead of Amari Cooper, went ahead of St. Brown, went a full 10 picks ahead of Devonta Smith. But I can tell you, I kind of get it. I understand because you look at Devonta Smith and you think about the Eagles and you think about Jalen Hurts and you just wonder, are they going to run so much that it's going to hurt Devonta Smith? And he's just going to have to be sort of an outlier if he's not getting crazy targets. And there's a chance that Elijah Moore doesn't get crazy targets either. I currently have Moore ahead of Devonta Smith in my receiver rankings.
I like it. I mean, and the consensus would agree with you. That shocked me just a little bit when I saw that coming out. But I've done a few startups myself, and it seems like they always are going right near each other. Now, let's go ahead and pivot a little bit. This is the fun part of the show where we get to talk about our triumphs and how great we are and how smart we are and how, we're always right and everybody else is always wrong. And I'll start off, the two that I was kind of proud of. A lot of people were big on the Brandon Ayuk and Robert Woods train. And I for whatever reason, just saw Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp as being the more valuable guys there. And this kind of goes to the AJ Dillon and Aaron Jones thing. Sometimes when you got two guys that I think are pretty similar in value, I'll usually just opt for the guy that's getting drafted later. And that was Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp. So I got those guys in a lot of my drafts. I was telling people to go out and draft them at that current value. And, I had a pretty good season where I made a decent amount of money strictly because of those two guys, regardless of all of my other misses. When you're getting Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp late in your drafts, it's going to help you out quite a bit. So that was one of my big hits, and I'm pretty proud of that one. But Joey, I know you had some huge hits last season. Which one are you most proud of?
The one that I'm most proud of, pride for a reason that I get to rub it in my father-in-law's face, which is always great, is he was huge on Chase Edmonds. And I was like, I'm going to wait for James Conner. I am. I feel like Conner's going to get the goal line work. And I proved to be pretty much right on that. The Cardinals had run in 2020, the 5th most plays in the league. And I didn't see their offense changing much. I saw Conner as more of the goal line back, which of course would lead him to score more touchdowns, you would think. And it expanded a little more than even I was expecting, with Conner getting 78.2 of the running back carries inside the 5-yard line. And Kyler Murray was actually second on the team in carries, and he only had 7. And I believe it was Conner had 23, I believe it was. Yeah. Conner had 18 total touchdowns in 2021, with 10 of them coming inside that 5-yard line. The week prior to Labor Day, Conner was going 106th overall in redraft, 39 picks later than Edmonds.
Yeah, I mean, James Conner kind of broke fantasy football this year because early in the season, everyone was saying, yeah, he's the RB, whatever, but it's unsustainable. It's his touchdown rate. It's going to come crashing back down to earth. Trade James Conner while you can. And then those that had James Conner traded him away for scraps. And then Chase Edmonds got hurt and James Conner went absolutely nuclear. So yeah, anybody that, went on a limb and took James Conner this year is pretty happy about that one. Do you have anything to add to this one, Dave, regarding the Arizona backfield, or maybe what we can expect next year?
Well, who knows what to expect next year, because they're both free agents.
All free agents.
And so, yeah. So we, who knows who the quarterback's going to be next year in Arizona? I think it'll be Kyler, but I mean, social media, scrubbing of the Instagram, I do it all the time. I think you've got to really look hard at that offense, and I wonder what they're thinking. My hunch is that Kingsbury, Steve Keim, that brain trust, obviously they want to have a quarterback who's capable. I think Kyler is that guy. But I think they want to have a run game that they can rely on. And I think they found James Conner to be reliable. How can they look at what he did last year and go, nah, we're not going to give him $6 million for 2022. And I think they like what they have in Chase Edmonds, but I think he might be the one that's more likely to walk. And they might prefer to have Conner. And they'll either, promote Eno Benjamin into a role to work with Conner. They'll have somebody to work there. I don't think they'll have one guy in that backfield. But I kind of like where Conner has ended up. And I not only do I think that the Cardinals are a great fit for him and that he should stay there and they know how to use him, I don't know if there's going to be another team in the league that saw James Conner and say, well, we got to pony up to get that guy. He's 27 years old, I believe. If not, he's 26. And we know about his history with injuries. And he's coming off a year where he didn't have an injury till late in the year. But he was very capable. I'm not going to draft him with the idea of him having 20 touchdowns, but I think he can work as the main guy in Arizona, and I'm hoping they bring him back.
Yeah, he's definitely one of the more intriguing free agents that I'll be keeping an eye on, because he had so many concerns with injuries heading into last year, and that's why Arizona was able to get him at such a phenomenal price. Yeah. And now you've got to wonder, are people still looking at his first 3 years of work where he was constantly injured, or are they looking at what he did last year and saying, we want to bring this guy in as a feature back? You already mentioned the age too. He's getting to that kind of, the edge of the apex. So there's a lot of ways that it can go this year for James Conner, but he's definitely one of the more intriguing free agent running backs out there. Well, Dave, let's talk about one of your hits. What's the one that you're most proud of? I want to hear this.
Well, okay. So I definitely have 3 hits that I like. Do I go there right away with the one that I'm proudest of, or do I wait?
Yeah,
and I think I'm going to go there. I think I'm going to go right away with this one. Right. And Dave, maybe just cover your ears a little bit, because I wrote in July, quote, maybe the easiest breakout call of the decade, end quote, was Jonathan Taylor. And it went further. It went further when injuries befell Quentin Nelson and Carson Wentz. There was a time where I was certainly nervous about Jonathan Taylor. And then I thought to myself, Quentin Nelson's probably going to be okay in the early part of the year. And Carson Wentz, it sounds like he's going to make progress and he'll be okay for the early part of the year. And this guy, in his final 6 regular season games as a rookie, totaled over 800 yards. He had 8 touchdowns. That 17-game pace puts him at over 2,000 total yards and 22 touchdowns. I don't think he's going to do that well, but I think he can be pretty good. And I basically was ready to take him as a top 5 running back by the time we got to late August last year, and had him on a bunch of teams. Traded him in one of them right after week 3 when he didn't start the year off hot, and right before that Dolphins game when he turned the ignition and he just took off. Just can't imagine what that team would have looked like if I hadn't have traded him straight up for Chris Godwin. Pretty dumb, but I had him in a lot of other teams, and I was, whereas I might have been really shy about getting Saquon, and I really, really took a big step back on Saquon last August. I stepped up with Jonathan Taylor, and I really felt that talent would win out. That's the lesson that you talked about, Dave. It's a great lesson to learn. And the offensive line ended up, listen, it was a roller coaster all year for both Wentz and the offensive line in Indianapolis, and Taylor shined pretty much every single game.
Yeah. I mean, going into next year, you can't even make an argument for anybody else as the first overall pick, right? With Jonathan Taylor's talent, with that offensive line. I mean, yeah, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, there's some good guys out there, but you can't realistically make a strong argument to take them over JT, can you?
I don't think you can take any of those guys over, but I remember people right after the season saying,
Cooper Kupp.
Yeah, exactly. Who it's got to be Cooper Kupp, right? Look at the year he just had. And it reminded me of all the fantasy managers out there that loved taking Lamar Jackson after his MVP year and Patrick Mahomes after his MVP year, where it's just you draft the guy that was amazing the year before, expecting it to be exactly the same thing, and it doesn't work that way. Sometimes players do better than they do the year before. We see that all the time, but a lot of the times they take a step back. I'm not saying that Jonathan Taylor is going to take a step back. I think he's pretty safe to be the best running back in fantasy football, provided that he stays healthy. That's another quarterback situation to watch in Indianapolis. What are they going to do with Carson Wentz? It sounds like they want nothing to do with him. It's crazy to me after what they just gave up to get him. But that offensive line, they got work to do at left tackle, but they should be pretty good. Hopefully they'll be healthier. And I think everybody knows what to expect workload-wise from Jonathan Taylor now.
Yeah. Well, Joey, let's go ahead and go back to you. What is another win that you had from this season that you want to do a little victory lap about?
I mean, just the Chargers offense. I had Eckler ranked 4th overall, and then I had Mike Williams as a sleeper. So it's pretty easy when you've got Herbert, slinging the ball the way he does. But the reason I loved Eckler so much was because of Joe Lombardi. What he did with Kamara and New Orleans, it got me excited, and I put him 4th overall, and he finished 4th overall this year. So, exactly where I said. So, here I am, a prophet, I guess.
I think you and I were in lockstep on that Chargers thing. We talked about that a lot during the offseason.
There was definitely an Austin Eckler group that was touting him quite a bit. But Mike Williams, I mean, he was the wide receiver 12 this year, and he was fantastic. And when I wrote my sleeper article, he was being drafted as the 46th wide receiver behind Will Fuller and that was mid-August. And I was like,
wow,
Will Fuller had not even practiced with the Dolphins at this point, like stepped on the field for with pads practice. And I just thought that was crazy. I didn't think he was going to be wide receiver 12, but I get to say, hey, he was a sleeper, and look how he did.
Yeah, the first fantasy football article that I ever wrote was about how Mike Williams was going to break out 4 years ago. And it didn't happen. And then the next season, I wrote another article about why this would be the season that Mike Williams would break out. Didn't happen. Did it a third time. And then finally last year, I just said, you know what? I'm done. I'm off the Mike Williams train. And over the course of the season, it did level out a little bit. But man, after finally throwing in the towel, after pumping this guy up for 4 years and seeing the start that he had to the season, I could not believe it. You want to talk about intriguing free agent options? I mean, that's another one right there. Mike Williams, is he fit to step in as a wide receiver 1 somewhere? Does he just stay with his role in Los Angeles? There are so many ways Mike Williams could go this offseason. That's another guy that I'm really going to be keeping a close eye on.
Well, are you going to write an article on him?
After he lands somewhere, possibly. I have actually gone on record, trying not to sound too much of a homer here, but I think he would be a great fit in Chicago, just playing opposite of Darnell Mooney. They have such different play styles, but they both have the ability to get downfield and get those jump balls. So I think that both of them are a lot more diverse in their route running abilities than people think. They think that they're both just field stretchers, but we saw last year Mike Williams was able to run routes all over the field, and Darnell
Yeah.
Mooney really expanded his route tree as well. So I think having two guys with different frames that can do similar things just would be really interesting on the same offense.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I felt like the A dot for Mike Williams was lower in the first half of the year than it was in the second half, and
Mhm.
they tried to go back to what he did in 2020, and that's when he really got inconsistent. 2020 he was inconsistent, and it happened again in the second part of the season. But that first part of the year, man, he was not working as far downfield. I can't imagine how much. I mean, I guess I could imagine how much better his season would have been if he hadn't dropped so many passes near the goal line or in the end zone. That's always going to be something that bugs me about him. But if you're going to write an article on him, Dave, I'm out on Mike Williams. It doesn't matter where he goes.
Perfect. Well, the thing, and you called it out, the A dot, and that's what was so frustrating because in the offseason, Joe Lombardi said that we are going to make Mike Williams the X receiver, the Michael Thomas of this offense, and then that's exactly what we saw through the first 6 or 7 weeks. And then, like you said, Dave, they just turned him back into a field stretching jump ball receiver. It made no sense to me. It's like they finally found the skeleton key to unlock Mike Williams, and then they just locked the door all over again. It was pretty frustrating to see. But back to you, Dave. Who's another guy that you pegged either up or down, just a win you had from last season? And I realize we're getting a little repetitive at this point, but
Sure. I nailed Jamar Chase. Wow, that sounded weird. I was correct in saying that Jamar Chase would be good for fantasy football as a rookie. Remember all the worries about the drops that he had in the preseason? That got me thinking
couldn't see a
about
football with the lines on it.
right. And like he stood up and spoke about it. And I just thought to myself, there is no damn way that a receiver this talented is going to turn into the clumsiest punk on the football field every week. And I went back and looked in 2019 when he was with Burrow at LSU. He had 121 targets. He had 5 drops. And I think drops happen, especially when you're getting targeted as much as a number one receiver gets targeted. And he did have drops in the year, but he also had a lot of huge plays. And I felt good trusting my intuition that a great receiver with a great quarterback, and I love Joe Burrow. It's easy to say. Everybody loved Joe Burrow when he was coming out of LSU. I felt for sure that he could end up being that best receiver in Cincinnati. Drafted him as such. We talked before the show about the Kings Classic. It's a draft that Joey and I were at in Canton in August. Took him in both of the leagues. Helped me get to the playoffs in both and in the finals in one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. If you drafted Jamar Chase this year, you were feeling pretty good about it. And I thought his ADP was a little bit rich when he was going in like the 3rd, 4th round. But like you said, those stories came out about the drops and the concentration, whatever it was. Joey and I, we were doing best ball drafts almost every single day last year. And we saw it just as soon as that story came out. There was like a 1-week stretch where Jamar Chase was dropping into the 7th and 8th round. And I couldn't believe it. And that's where I got my exposure on him. So I was happy to get him at that discount because man, any little story that time of year, people just become so reactive to. I mean, you remember when BC Johnson was going to be the wide receiver 1 over Justin Jefferson, right? Just 2 years ago. Yeah, every once in a while, you get that little bit of that story that comes out where you say, yes, this is my opportunity to capitalize. Well, nice call on Jamar Chase. I mean, that was a good one, and it was pretty crazy. But there were people out there that were fading him last year, despite the draft capital and being reunited with with Joe Burrow and all that. There were still people there that just didn't really buy it. Joey, back to you though. Let's talk about another big win that you had from the 2021 season.
I sandwiched them both into the Mike Williams, Austin Eckler thing. Those are my 3.
All right.
Here we go.
Dave, anything else you want to talk about? If not, I'd like to get into at least one general takeaway from the season.
Let's put a lesson with this one. I didn't draft Michael Thomas in any of my fantasy leagues. Easy to say now, he didn't play. But he was on the PUP list to start the year. We knew that the injury was going to be a problem. My argument for not taking him, and I saw him go as high as round 6 in some drafts, but really he was settling around pick 100 overall. I refused to take him before pick 100 overall because he didn't have Drew Brees. I wasn't sure how Jameis was going to play with him. I knew Jameis would be a better quarterback than Taysom Hill. I also liked what I saw from Marquez Callaway. We can chalk that up as a miss, but I thought that Callaway would actually end up impacting the number of targets that Michael Thomas would get when Thomas came back. And I also had to bake in, and I thought it was a very small chance when I talked about it in August, but there was a small chance that Michael Thomas wouldn't come back, or he might come back, but it's going to be at the tail end of the window when you can come off the PUP list. And then you're literally stashing him on your bench for 10 weeks of the football season. And I thought that was just a bad managerial move. And what I told people at the time was, if you like Michael Thomas, don't draft him, trade for him mid-October or whenever the headlines really start to get hot about him coming back. And so I feel like a lot of people might have taken that advice and then just not bothered trading for Michael Thomas, because what were you going to do with him? Especially once news came out right around, I think it was right around the trade deadline. Am I wrong on that? Or maybe it was right. It's probably around the same time, the PUP list, the PUP window ending, and the trade deadline, close to being right around the same time, where he wasn't going to come back and play. Felt great that I didn't have to bother with a bench spot on him. Felt great that I didn't spend a top 80 or 90 pick on Michael Thomas.
Yeah, I spent many an 8th round pick on Michael Thomas last year. So what are we expecting this season? I mean, from what I've been reading, it seems like he's ready to play and go back, but I don't know. I mean, is it a mental thing? Is it injuries? Like what is going on with Mike Thomas? Can you enlighten me? Because I don't really know what's making this situation.
I think that there are a lot of variables going on with Michael Thomas. It sounds like he's going to stay with the Saints in part because the Saints have all these crazy cap problems, and I don't think trading or releasing him would help those cap problems. So they might as well keep him. They know he's good. They might as well let him play. And, I don't know how competitive the Saints are going to be this year. They're easily the team in the worst salary cap shape in the NFL, and they're changing coaches. I don't know how good they're going to be with Pete Carmichael tailoring things and Sean Payton not making changes from week to week. I'm worried about him coming back and being a top 12 type of fantasy receiver. You want to tell me he's a top 24 fantasy receiver, especially in PPR? I can believe that. Even if it's Jameis at quarterback, I can believe that. I think that he can do that, and maybe he's got the upside to be top 12, but I just wonder if he's going to be a completely different guy without Drew Brees, without Sean Payton, with health being an issue. Is there a motivation problem? We know he's got a little bit of that wide receiver attitude that sometimes works for a guy and sometimes doesn't work for a guy. He's probably going to be another receiver I fade unless I get him at a good value on draft day. And I imagine that there will probably be 3 or 4 people in every single fantasy draft that like Michael Thomas, and they're going to take him before I'm willing to take him. And by the way, the lesson to be learned is that when there's a player who's on the PUP list to begin the season, unless you are sure that his situation is going to be perfect for him when he comes off that PUP list, you shouldn't spend a round 7 or round 8 pick for him. And we can think about that with somebody like James Robinson, who tore his Achilles late last year. It was a heartbreaker of an injury. He was a guy that I liked a lot and drafted a lot of, even when Travis Etienne was healthy. But can he do what Cam Akers did? And if he does what Cam Akers did, is he going to look like Cam Akers did when Cam Akers came back? Because Cam Akers didn't look so great. I know the matchups were tough for him in the playoffs, but he didn't explode very much. And so I wonder if people are going to see James Robinson in round 6 and round 7 in their fantasy drafts and think, all right, I'm going to get him at a discount. He was good for a spurt or 2 in 2021, but ETN's there, different coaching staff's there. They might add another running back. I mean, they got to add somebody because they can't go in with the guys they had last year on their bench. Maybe you look at guys that are on that PUP list and say, all right, not only am I not going to worry about them for the first 6 weeks of the season, I don't want them on my bench. I don't want them to clog up a roster spot unless you can stash them. And we're entering a time in fantasy where we can use IR spots. I actually had a meeting today with the leaders of our product here at CBS Sports. We are considering adding PUP and IR to the same kind of tag on fantasy lineups, meaning that you can stash a PUP guy. And that changes things a little bit. Maybe you would spend that round 7 or 8 capital on James Robinson, knowing that he won't cost you one of your bench spots, but one of your IR spots that you can always play with. And that's assuming that he's on the PUP list to begin the season. So guys that aren't going to be ready to go for the first month of the year, really take a cautious approach with them on draft day. Don't make assumptions that they're going to come back and be a house of fire when they return.
Yeah, and we saw so many late season injuries, so I think that's a really good point to bring up because we saw that late season injury with Michael Thomas and how that affected his season last year, and now with Chris Godwin, Odell Beckham Jr., Robert Woods, James Robinson, and I'm sure there's some others that I'm even forgetting about, but we saw a lot of fantasy relevant players have big injuries, significant injuries at the end of the season. So, even Etienne, we were just talking about James Robinson, but Etienne's a guy that I'm, pretty excited about. But then I started looking and reading some of the reports, and he injured himself, almost 8 months ago now. And it was just last week that he was resuming light running and weightlifting. So even that makes me a little bit concerned. I like where he's at right now with the value, but I want to see him cutting and running a little bit before I can start drafting him, because he's still got a long road to recovery ahead of him.
Yeah, I would imagine that we'll see and hear that before drafts really heat up in August. Like right now, if you're doing your best balls, that's an assumption that I think you can make, is that ETN will participate in training camp. If not sooner than that, he'll have enough time to recover from the foot injury. How he'll look, how explosive will he be? Can he cut off that foot? We'll see. Those Liz Frank injuries can go either way. The track record of those, sometimes players come back and they're just fine. Sometimes they come back and they're never the same.
Yeah, and one of the guys that I saw that was able to come back after suffering a similar severity, having to go under the knife and surgery and all that, was Julio Jones, who did it early in his career, came back and had 5 straight seasons with 1,400 yards. So people have come back, but we've also seen, like you said, the range of outcomes for this injury is about as wide as possible. Joey, before we sign off here, I've got one takeaway that I want to talk about, but did you have something that you want to talk about, just an overall general takeaway, something that you learned last season?
So I wrote the waiver wire column, and I guess this is kind of like, what did I learn on my first, because I did this for my first year this year. And I was really conservative on buzzy players, most notably Elijah Mitchell. So this is kind of a miss. But what I learned is not to be short-sighted. When I'm thinking it might just be temporary. Next season, I'll definitely push more towards potential and not lean just on long-term opportunity.
Yeah, I am. God, I'm a squirrel when it comes to fab. I like saving all of my fab until the very end of the season, and you miss out on guys like Elijah Mitchell. But that's a fun conversation to have, just as far as like game theory. Dave, I want to get your take on this. I mean, were you splashing fab early in the season on a guy like Elijah Mitchell, or are you somebody that's typically waiting for the Rashad Penny and Deonta Foreman later on in the season?
I didn't think Elijah Mitchell was worth 100% of the fab when it happened. The only exception would be if you had Raheem Mostert and you went 0 RB and you didn't have anybody else good. And it's just, when it comes to fab, it's really, I feel like it's case specific. There's always going to be that time where, running back gets hurt, the backup is good, you got to spend. And there's always the advice of, well, it's week 12, you're making your playoff push, you got to spend whatever you got to spend to get the backup that's going to be playing for a few weeks. When it was AJ Dillon, remember there was that week where we didn't know what was going to happen with Aaron Jones, and we thought AJ Dillon would. I wasn't ready to call him a league winner, but I said that he was the playoff pusher. Like, he'd be the guy that would propel you into the playoffs. I don't think I used the word pusher. That sounds a little too druggy style. I don't want to think of AJ Dillon as a drug, although you can feel intoxicated watching him play. I don't want to say that I'm a squirrel when it comes to fab. I want to be shrewd when it comes to fab, though. And maybe I was saying a third of your fab on Elijah Mitchell. I might have been saying less than that. Maybe I'm just trying to save some face here. But I was worried that Mitchell would be, some good weeks, some bad weeks. Trey Sermon waiting in the wings.
Trey Sermon.
Jeff Wilson eventually coming back. Yeah, like there were so many other names in that backfield that I felt
Kyle
like
Shanahan
it was
is a general umbrella.
Exactly. So, and that's why I think people can't rush to take Elijah Mitchell in 2022 drafts either. I like him, but that offense is changing if Trey Lance is going to be the quarterback. And there has never been a runner in the years that Kyle Shanahan's been in San Francisco, never had a guy repeat as the lead running back, yardage wise or touch wise, I believe, for the 49ers from year to year. And if that trend continues, then Elijah Mitchell is going to be a big bust, and people who take him with an early round pick, they're going to be pretty disappointed.
Yeah, I mean, with the way Kyle Shanahan operates things, it wouldn't surprise me to see Trey Sermon just come out next year and be the guy. I mean, we really have no idea. But
Sure.
I'd be remiss not to talk about this, because we have mentioned AJ Dillon a couple times and how fun he is on the field. Somehow I ended up in a fantasy football league with AJ Dillon this year, and with a lot of very big analysts. Evan Silva was in this, Scott Fish, Ryan McDowell, some very good fantasy football players. AJ Dillon is just as good at fantasy football as he is at regular football. He won this league, a 12-team league full of analysts. It was the first time AJ Dillon had ever played, and he smoked us all. So I just got to give him props.
Yeah, I want to know what his team
Elijah
was.
Mitchell was on his team. But at the end of the season, he was starting Deonta Foreman, Rashad Penny, and Amon St. Brown. Those were the three guys that carried him. I mean, he snuck in as the last seed in the playoffs and then just had all of those guys that hit late in the season. And it was impressive to see. And I mean, he was hustling all season too. It was funny because an hour before his game would kick off, he'd be sending out trade requests. Like,
I love that. I love that.
He was sitting in the locker room. And we saw even when he picked up Amon St. Brown, we were like, what's CJ doing? And sure enough, 2 weeks later, he ended up going nuts. So, there might have been some insider trading in there. He might have been privy to a little bit of information that we didn't get, but man, he kicked all of our butts, and it was fun to see.
Along those lines, I was in a league. This is the league where I traded Jonathan Taylor for Chris Godwin after week 3, and I still keep myself up at night over it. I was in a league with Eric Weddle, who made the finals, but finished in second. He didn't win the league. And then he went on to sign with the Rams, and he won a Super Bowl. So another player who knew his stuff, and I don't know the first thing about his team, but I know that he was good enough to make the finals in that league that he was in. So
yeah,
something to it with these players that play fantasy football. They know their stuff. It's almost like they know football better than the rest of us.
Yeah. Who'd have thunk it that football players know a little bit about the sport that they play? The one takeaway, though, that I want to hit on before we sign off here, and this was the first year that I think I finally kind of came to this. I am always been a robust running back guy. In my first 6 rounds, I'm trying to walk out with 4 running backs. And this was the year where everybody said, the running back dead zone. I never bought into it. And this year, that running back dead zone was just an absolute graveyard. I went back through and looked at the guys that were getting selected there. Myles Gaskin, Mike Davis, Raheem Mostert, Kareem Hunt, Darrell Henderson, Gus Edwards, Chase Edmonds, Melvin Gordon. I mean, you got a couple guys in there that you could have started for the entire season, but I think this is the year where I am just completely off running backs there. I'm going to get my running back in the first 1 or 2 rounds, and then I am going to be stockpiling receivers, maybe a tight end or a quarterback in there, but I think rounds 4 through 7, I am just completely off on running backs. Get my guys early and then wait for some high upside guys later on.
I mean, I think it changes from year to year, but if you think about it, the most popular running backs are going to go first every year in fantasy. That's just the way that things are. And then the less popular running backs are going to be there for the taking for fantasy managers that go, all right, I need a running back and I know this guy's name and I saw him do well last year, or he's, is Travis Etienne going to end up in that round 4 to 7 range, Dave? I think it's possible that he does. And yeah. And so does that mean that you can't touch him? You're going to be excited about some of the running backs that go in that range. And I would just tell you,
it was last year, Chris Carson and Raheem Mostert, and Mostert was an injury. I mean, that's a little, and I guess Carson was too, but that was a tough year, man.
It was a tough year. So look, I was guilty of Gaskin. I thought Gaskin would be a heavily utilized part of the Dolphins offense. Saw him practice. I'm in South Florida, so I went to a Dolphins practice, and he was working with the 2-minute offense, and he was working with the starters. And when I see something like that, I think to myself, this guy's going to be involved in what he does. And then the regular season comes around, and he's not nearly as involved as I thought he'd be, and that just really depressed me and made me wonder, well, why did I see him practice like he was the lead guy? And then it turns out he wasn't the lead guy. What does that mean? And I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about that this offseason. But Mike Davis to me was an easy call. I didn't want to touch him. I just felt like he wasn't a great. I didn't think he had that great pedigree. Chase Edmonds, kind of the same thing. Like I liked where the head was at with Joey, not taking Chase Edmonds and then waiting for James Conner. And maybe that's the kind of thinking. The running backs that are in the dead zone, you will look at them. You will look at the running backs behind them. You'll make a decision on which one you like better. The running backs that you like better that you can find later, you're taking them. You're avoiding the running back in the dead zone. But the running backs where if it's Travis Etienne and the next best guy throwing a name out, Carlos Hyde, because James Robinson's on the shelf, man, I'm not going to wait to draft Carlos Hyde. That's not exciting. That's not fun. So even if Travis Etienne's going in the dead zone, I'm going to cross my fingers and hope he doesn't end up in the dead zone by the time we get to week 7 or week 8. And maybe the type of attitude you should have with those running backs is, I hope these guys can help me get to a point in the fantasy season where if I need to pivot off of them and go in a different direction, I can, but they can at least help get me there. Almost like running a poll where you wonder if running back A, who's guaranteed to average 25 PPR points per game, is going to get hurt after the midpoint of the season, but running back B is going to get you 15 PPR fantasy points and is guaranteed to stay healthy for all 17 games. Maybe something like that.
Man, I just got to address that for a second. Everyone thinks that I was like some evil genius that had this like plan for months. I was in the shower and that just popped into my head. 10 minutes later, I hop and I literally spent the entire shower just thinking, who would I prefer? And then I just tweeted it out on a
TMI, Dave. TMI.
I'm sorry. I know it's way too much information. I was showering fully clothed. Don't get any weird images.
Okay.
But so I have this random shower thought, tweet it out, grab my dog, go for a walk, come back a half hour later, and my phone is blowing up. And I couldn't figure out why. Like it was literally just a random thought that really made people go a little bit crazy. But fun thought conversation for sure, and sparked some pretty intriguing conversations. Did you have a chance to see Adam Harstad's take on this yet, where he built an entire spreadsheet where you can input the variables for your team to see exactly what edge you get? I mean, I love stuff like that. That silly thought that I had is now something that is a project for Adam Harstad to work on. I loved it.
It wasn't the end result that the 15 point per game running back was technically a little bit better than the 25
point per game running back? It came down to league settings. If the 25 point running back, if you're in a league that only has 4 playoff spots, that's better for you. If you're in a league that has multiple playoff spots, you want the guy with the lower floor. It came down to bench spots as well. The more bench spots you have, it's better to have the guy with the lower floor because you're less likely to get somebody off of waivers. So there were so many variables that went into it. But he said on a standard league with a 10-person bench and PPR and just your typical standard league, you had a 0.007% better chance of winning with Derrick Henry as opposed to Zeke. I mean, 0.007%. And I think that's why it became such a hot topic, because it really, really was that close, but definitely fun to talk about. Anyway, though, had a great show today. Like I said, glad we finally got to connect. Joey, glad we got to have you back on the show. Before we sign off,
thank you.
Dave, one more time, why don't you go ahead and let everybody know where they can find you? We know that you're over at CBS Sports HQ, the home of fantasy football today, and the 24/7 streaming home for sports news, highlights, and analysis. Am I missing anything? Is there anything else we should be looking out for this offseason?
I don't know if there's anything else to look for this offseason, but I always appreciate the banner back and forth and the conversation that we have on Twitter. So if you've got a fantasy question, I'm happy to help you. Like I said earlier in the show, our podcast, we really love helping people win their leagues, and that extends to social media, twitter.com/Dave Richard.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Dave. And Joey, one more time, let everyone know where they can find you over at Front Yard Fantasy and Razzball, where they can find start, sit, salutations, and anything fun that you got cooking this off season.
So yeah, I can attest to what Dave's saying about him giving advice to people on Twitter, because I was that guy for a very long time with Dave. But yeah, at the Joey Wright on Twitter, I'll have another season of start, sits, and salutations. That's like my big project this off season. I'm writing it all. I even heard a rumor that he might be making an appearance at the Expo. I don't know if that's true or not. So if you're going to Fantasy Football Expo, you might run into him. I don't know.
Wow.
Looking forward to it. It'll be a good time. Yeah, it seems like the buzz for the Expo is exponentially bigger than it was last year, and we're still almost 6 months away. So that'll be a good time. It's always fun getting together. But want to thank everybody on the Footballguys Network that is tuned into this show for the first time. We will be bringing the show to you every single Friday during the off season and in season. I'm your host, Dave Kluge. You can find me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. That's Kluge. Be sure to subscribe to the Footballguys YouTube page at youtube.com/footballguys, and I will catch you next week. Thanks for checking out that video. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube page at youtube.com/footballguys if you haven't already. Drop a like on this video and feel free to respond down in the replies if you've got anything that you'd like to add. See you next week.